My husband sent me a text at 20 past 2 on a Tuesday that said, "I'm worth $8 million now. Pack a bag and be gone by Friday. The house is mine." I was standing at the kitchen sink with my hands in dishwater when I read it. I dried them on the dish towel, set the phone face down on the counter, and finished washing the coffee mugs. What he didn't know, what he'd somehow let himself forget after 39 years, was sitting in a fireproof box in the hall closet, and it was going to cost him a great deal more than $8 million. Good afternoon, friends. It's me again, and I'm so glad you're here. Before I go on, do me a small kindness. Tap that like button, stay with me to the very end, and tell me in the comments which town you're listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me tell you how a man can spend nearly 40 years sleeping beside a woman and still not know who she is. My name is Estelle, and I'm 66 years old. For most of my life, I was the kind of woman nobody notices, which is to say, I was the kind of woman who notices everything. I spent 31 years keeping the books for a building supply company outside Asheville, North Carolina. Ledgers, payroll, quarterly taxes, the whole quiet machinery that keeps a business breathing. I raised one daughter, buried both my parents, and made a home in a white clapboard house up a gravel road in the mountains, the kind of place where the fog sits in the valley until 10 in the morning. I thought I knew my life the way I knew the multiplication tables. Solid. Settled. Done being surprised. I married my husband when I was 27. He was charming back then in a loud, easy way. The man who told the joke at the party and watched to make sure everybody laughed. He sold farm equipment, then trucks, then insurance, then nothing in particular, and somewhere in his 50s he got it into his head to start a little company manufacturing custom trailer, hitches, and towing parts. Everyone told him it was foolish. I didn't. I believed in him, God help me, and more to the point, I had the money to back him. That part matters, so hold on to it. When my mother passed in 2009, she left me her savings and the deed to the very house we were living in. She'd bought it for us years before and kept it in her name and then signed it to mine alone, never his. A woman should always have a door that's hers, she used to say. I used to think it was an old-fashioned thing to say. I don't anymore. When my husband wanted to start his trailer parts company, I took $41,000 of my mother's money and put it in. And because I'd spent 3 decades around contracts and ledgers, I did not just hand it to him like a sweetheart slipping a man a 20. I had a lawyer draw up the company papers properly, and on those papers, my name sits right next to his. 50%. An equal member. I signed it, he signed it, and then we both forgot about it because the business grew slow and small, and the paperwork went into the fireproof box in the hall closet and gathered 11 years of dust. He did not forget the money he was about to make. He forgot where it came from. The trouble started, the way it always seems to, about 6 months before that text. My husband changed. He bought a gym membership and started coming home with his hair damp and a strange new energy in his shoulders. There was a cologne in the bathroom I'd never smelled before. Something sharp and young. He put a passcode on his phone and turned the screen away from me at the dinner table. He talked about the next chapter and finally living, and looked at our quiet little life like it was a coat that had gotten too tight. I'm not a fool. I've watched enough men leave enough women to know the signs. But knowing and admitting are 2 different countries, and I lived in denial for those months because the truth was too heavy to pick up. I kept telling myself it was a phase, a midlife thing, that he'd come back around. I made his favorite pot roast. I let it go. Then came the buyout. A bigger company down in Charlotte had been circling the trailer parts business for a year, wanting the patents and the contracts. My husband handled the negotiations himself and kept the details close, which I noticed but didn't push on. When the deal finally closed, the company sold for a figure that made him a wealthy man overnight. $8 million, give or take, after the bigger firm's offer and the earnout. I remember the evening he found out. He came in the door, and instead of joy, I saw something cold settle over his face, a kind of calculation. He poured himself a drink and stood in the middle of the living room and said, almost to himself, "This changes everything." The way he said everything. I felt it in my stomach like swallowing a stone. I told myself we'd take that trip to the coast I'd always wanted. Help our daughter with the down payment on a real house instead of that cramped rental. Set up something for the grandbabies. I let myself dream for about 4 days, then he texted me to get out by Friday. After the first message came a second, and then a third, faster than I could answer, and reading them was like being slapped over and over by a hand I'd held for 39 years. The house is mine. The money's mine. You were just along for the ride. You never built anything. He actually wrote that. You never built anything. This from a man whose business books I balanced for free at the kitchen table for 11 years, whose mother I nursed through her last winter, whose suits I picked up from the cleaners, whose dignity I propped up at every dinner party where he told a joke and watched to make sure everybody laughed. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I stood very still in my own kitchen, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, which was clarity. Cold, clean clarity, like stepping out of a stuffy room into mountain air. I walked into the living room, and there were the divorce papers, already spread across the coffee table, his signature scrawled big and proud at the bottom of every page. Beside them was an envelope. Inside the envelope was a check made out to me for $15,000 and a sticky note in his handwriting that said, "For your trouble, don't make this hard. For my trouble." 39 years, and I was a bit of trouble being settled with a tip. I heard his car in the gravel before I'd finished reading. The front door opened, and he wasn't alone. A woman came in behind him, younger than our daughter, with a blowout and a handbag that probably cost more than my first car, and a smile on her face that told me she'd been told all about me, the dull little wife who was finally being shown the door. He didn't even have the decency to leave her in the car. "Oh, good, you're still here," he said, dropping his keys in the dish by the door like it was any ordinary Tuesday. "This is going to be quick. This is," he gestured at her, "a friend. We're going to need the house cleared out. I figured I'd let you take the personal stuff. I'm being generous." The friend gave me a little wave. I will remember that wave until the day I die. I looked at him. Really looked. The way you look at a photograph of someone after they've passed, searching for the person you thought you knew. And then, to his complete confusion, I smiled and I picked up the pen. "You're right," I said. "Let's make this quick." He'd braced for tears. I watched him brace for them, almost looked forward to them, the proof that he'd won. Instead, I signed the divorce papers in my neat bookkeeper's hand. Every line, every initial, the same signature I'd signed on our marriage license in 1987. I slid the stack across the table to him. "There," I said. "Good luck to you. I mean that." He relaxed. He actually grinned at the friend. "But before I go," I said, standing and picking up my purse, "I want to make sure you understand a couple of things, because you seem confused about whose house this is." It's mine," I said. "It's been titled in my name alone since 2009. My mother left it to me. Your name has never been on this deed, not once, not for one single day, so I'm not the one who's leaving. You are. You and your friend can be off my property within the hour, or I'll call the sheriff and have you removed as trespassers. I'll give you the same generosity you gave me. Go pack a bag." The color went out of his face like water out of a sink. "You can't." "I can. And there's one more thing, but I think I'll let you find that one out from your lawyer. Get a good one." I picked up the $15,000 check, tore it in half, and set the 2 pieces gently on top of his beautiful divorce papers. "For your trouble," I said. I walked out the front door, got in my car, and drove down the mountain with my hands perfectly steady on the wheel. It wasn't until I reached the bottom, where the gravel meets the county road, that I had to pull over, because my whole body started to shake at once. Not from fear. From the strange, terrible thrill of a woman who has just stopped being polite. I drove to my daughter's house. She opened the door, took one look at my face, and pulled me inside before I'd said a word. "Mom, what did he do?" I told her. All of it, sitting at her little kitchen table while my son-in-law put the kettle on and the grandbabies watched cartoons in the next room. My daughter cried, which made me steadier somehow, because one of us had to be. When I got to the part about the deed and the trespassing and tearing up the check, my son-in-law set down his mug and said, very quietly, "Estelle, the company papers, aren't you on those?" And there it was, the thing my husband forgot. I'd put it so far out of my mind that it took me a moment to find it. The fireproof box in the hall closet, the lawyer in 2009, $41,000 of my mother's money, and an operating agreement that named me a 50% member of the limited liability company my husband had just sold for $8 million. He hadn't sold his business. He'd sold our business. And he'd sold half of it without the signature of the woman who owned that half. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my daughter's guest room staring at the ceiling, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, I stopped feeling shocked and started feeling something colder and more useful. He had spent 6 months and $8 million convincing himself I was nothing. He'd been so sure of it that he hadn't bothered to check. Men like my husband never do when they think they're holding all the cards. They forget that somebody dealt them. The next morning, I went home. My home, with him gone from it, his closet half empty where he'd grabbed what he could in a hurry. I opened the fireproof box. The operating agreement was right where it had been for 11 years, the paper a little yellowed, my signature and his side by side under the words, "Member, 50%. I sat down on the hallway floor with it in my lap and I started to laugh, and then I started to cry, and then I called a lawyer. Finding the right one took 3 tries. The first wanted to settle fast and quiet. The second talked over me. The third was a woman about 10 years younger than me, with reading glasses pushed up into gray streaked hair and an office that smelled like old paper and strong coffee. I'll call her the lawyer, because she earned the title, and then some. I laid everything on her desk, the deed, the operating agreement, the torn check, the photo my daughter had quietly snapped of the friend waving in my living room. The lawyer read the operating agreement twice. Then she took off her glasses and looked at me. "Did your husband disclose your ownership stake during the sale of this company?" she asked. "I don't think he disclosed I exist," I said. A slow smile. "Mrs. Estelle, I want to be careful not to promise you the moon. But I have to tell you, your husband may have made a number of very expensive mistakes, and they're all written down." She tapped the papers. "This isn't a he said, she said. This is documents. Courts love documents." Over the next weeks, I learned things about my marriage that the marriage itself had hidden from me. The lawyer subpoenaed records, and the records talked. The friend, it turned out, was not a recent development. He'd been seeing her for over a year, and he'd been spending on her the whole time. There were hotel charges, a leased convertible in her name that he was paying for, a diamond tennis bracelet, a deposit on a beachfront condo down in Wilmington with both their names on the paperwork. By the lawyer's count, he had spent just over $190,000 of marital money on the friend while telling me we couldn't afford to fix the back deck. I won't pretend that didn't hurt. It did. There's a particular ache in finding out the man who said you were too expensive was quietly buying another woman a beach condo. But the ache had somewhere to go now, and that made all the difference. There were dark days in there, I'll be honest with you. There were mornings I woke up at 4 and couldn't get back to sleep, lying in the bed that was suddenly too big, listening to a house that was suddenly too quiet. There was the afternoon I ran into an old church friend at the grocery store who'd already heard, and the pity on her face nearly undid me right there by the canned vegetables. There was the night my husband called, drunk and wheedling, saying we could work something out, keep the lawyers out of it, be reasonable, and I had to hang up and sit in the dark and remind myself out loud that being reasonable had nearly cost me everything I owned. But here is what I learned in those dark days. Grief and anger are heavy, but they're not the same weight as being trapped, and I was not trapped anymore. Every morning I got up, I drank my coffee on the porch and watched the fog burn off the valley, and I told myself one true thing: I am not the one who has to be ashamed. His lawyer came at us first with bluster, a tall, expensive man in a suit who clearly billed by the syllable. He argued the business was my husband's alone, that I'd been a passive investor, a wife who'd written a check and stepped back. My lawyer let him talk himself out. Then she slid the operating agreement across the conference table, the page where it said, "Member, 50% with full voting rights," and asked him to explain how his client had sold an asset he only half owned without the other owner's consent. and whether his client had disclosed that little detail to the buyer down in Charlotte, because if not, the buyer might be very interested to learn the sale could be challenged. The expensive lawyer asked for a recess. They always do when the documents come out. It went to court anyway because my husband could not bring himself to believe a woman he dismissed as nothing could actually beat him. He wanted his day. He got it. I want to tell you about that courtroom because I'd never been in one before and I was terrified. And it turned out to be the proudest morning of my life. I wore a navy dress I bought new. My daughter sat behind me on one side, my son-in-law on the other, and a few church friends filled the row. My husband sat across the aisle in a suit I recognized. I picked it up from the cleaners myself, years ago, and beside him, of all the gall in this world, sat the friend in a white dress, like she had any business being there at all. The judge was a woman with short silver hair and the patience of someone who has watched 1,000 men explain why the rules shouldn't apply to them. She let both sides make their case. My husband's lawyer painted me as a bitter wife after a payday. My lawyer simply read the documents into the record, one at a time, in a flat, clear voice, and let them do the work. The deed, the operating agreement, the bank statements, the hotel charges, the leased convertible, the condo deposit with 2 names on it. When she finished, the judge looked at her notes for a long moment, and then she began to speak, and I held my daughter's hand under the table. First, the judge said, the house at the end of that gravel road was my separate property. It had come to me by inheritance, titled in my name alone, never refinanced with marital funds. My husband had no claim to 1 shingle of it. I felt my shoulders drop an inch. Second, the judge said, the business that my husband had sold was a marital asset, and beyond that, the operating agreement plainly established me as a 50% owner, a fact my husband had failed to disclose during the sale and failed to honor in his settlement offer. Half of the proceeds from that $8 million sale were legally mine and had been mine the entire time. Across the aisle, my husband made a sound like the air going out of him. Third, the judge said, there was the matter of marital waste. North Carolina takes a dim view of a spouse spending marital money on an affair, and my husband had spent just over $190,000 on the woman sitting beside him in the white dress. That amount, the judge ruled, would be charged against his share and awarded to me. At that, the friend stood up and said something I won't repeat, and the judge told her to sit down and be silent or be removed, and for once in the proceedings, somebody did exactly as I'd been wanting to do all morning. Fourth, the judge addressed the retirement accounts and the remaining marital property, dividing them evenly, which by my quick arithmetic, and I'm a bookkeeper, my arithmetic is never slow, left my husband with a great deal less than the $8 million he'd been so eager to throw me out of the house for. And then the judge took off her glasses and looked directly at my husband, and she said something I will carry with me the rest of my days. She said that this court did not look kindly on a man who treated the mother of his child with contempt after 39 years, who paraded his affair into the marital home, who tried to strip his wife of her property and her dignity in a single afternoon. She said his conduct would be reflected in the award of attorney's fees, which he would be paying in full. Mine. The gavel came down. My daughter put her face in my shoulder. My son-in-law squeezed my arm. The lawyer leaned over and said, very quietly, "You won, Estelle." All the way down the line. I looked across that courtroom one last time. My husband sat staring at the table, gray-faced, an old man all of a sudden, while his expensive lawyer packed his briefcase fast. And the friend was already gone. She'd walked out the moment the numbers turned against him, and she did not look back, and neither, I realized, did I need her to. I gathered my purse, took my daughter's hand, and walked out of that courthouse into the September sun, with my chin up for the first time in longer than I could remember. That was 18 months ago. I'm sitting on my own porch as I tell you this, the same porch where I used to talk myself through the bad mornings, except they aren't bad anymore. The fog is lifting off the valley, the way it always does. There's a cup of good coffee at my elbow and a book I'm actually reading instead of just holding. I kept the house, of course. I repainted the kitchen a yellow my husband always hated, and it makes me smile every single morning. Last spring, I took that trip to the coast I'd dreamed about for 40 years, except I went further than the coast. I flew to Portugal, all by myself, and I ate custard tarts in the sunshine and walked on cobblestones 1,000 years old, and I cried a little, but they were good tears, the kind you cry when you finally let yourself have something. I gave my daughter the down payment for a real house, the one with a yard for the grandbabies. I started taking a watercolor class at the community center on Thursday nights, and I'm not good at it, and I don't care, because nobody at that table needs me to be anything but exactly who I am. I joined a book club. I volunteer at the library on Mondays. I have, if I'm honest with you, more friends now at 66 than I had at 46, because it turns out I'd spent 20 years shrinking myself down to fit a life that was always too small. About my husband, I'll tell you what I know, and then I'll let him go. The friend left him within a month of the ruling. There was no longer a beach condo or a tennis bracelet in it for her, and she was, I gather, not the sentimental type. He made some bad bets with what was left of his share, and lost a good chunk of it. He lives alone now in an apartment across town. Our daughter speaks to him only when she has to. He sent me a letter once, last winter, 3 pages of regret and self-pity, asking if there was any way back. I read it once, all the way through, and then I put it in the fire and watched it curl up and disappear, and I felt nothing but a quiet, clean kind of peace. He thought $8 million would buy him a new life. What it bought him was a lonely apartment and a daughter who screens his calls. I had no millions when I started over, just a house in my name and a box of papers he forgot about, and I am the richest woman I know. Here is what I want you to take from an old woman on a porch in the mountains. For decades I made myself quiet and convenient and small, and I called it love. And it was not love. It was fear wearing love's coat. A door that's yours is worth more than a man who stops seeing you. Your name on the paper is worth more than his promises. And it is never, ever too late. Not at 60, not at 70, not ever, to stand up in your own kitchen and decide you are not the one who's leaving. So tell me, friend, what would you have done that Tuesday afternoon with the divorce papers on the table and a stranger waving from your own living room? Would you have signed quietly and walked away with $15,000 and your head down? Or would you have picked up the pen and smiled and reminded him whose house he was standing in? Leave me a comment and let me know. Share this with a woman who needs to hear it today. And remember, every one of you, you are never too old and never too tired and never too far gone to choose yourself.